Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you to Mayash for having us here to talk to you about RCS. Our panelists today, our first panelist is Jason Linford. Jason is the practice manager for occupational hygiene here at Greencap. He's got over 15 years experience in HSE and occupational hygiene within several management positions, operating across multiple sectors and industries. So welcome, Jason. We also have joining us today Julie Sullivan. Julie Sullivan is a certified industrial hygienist, and she's got over 25 years experience in the fields of occupational hygiene, hazardous materials and environmental consulting. So welcome, Julie. And finally, we have Jason Green. Jason Green is a certified occupational hygienist and a full member of the Australian Institute of Occupational Hygiene. He's got over 27 years experience in the fields of occupational hygiene, indoor air and environmental quality, chemical exposure, hazardous materials and WHS. So welcome to all three of our panelists. I will just do a quick caveat. Jason Green has actually been called out to a cement plant client today, unexpectedly, dealing with some RCS issues. So if at any point his video or mute button has to go on, then he's been called out to an emergency. So without further ado, we'll start off. So today we're going to start off with a bit of an introduction. What is respirable crystalline silica, where it can be encountered, and also what are the key legislative obligations on all of us to manage that. We'll then move through some scenarios and case studies where each of our SMEs will talk around their experiences and the particular controls put in those scenarios. And then we'll move to close with a brief summary before we open Q&A. Thank you to those of you who have put forward questions ahead of the webinar. We will endeavour to answer them as we go through, and also feel free to put them in when we move to the final QA. So before we kick off, we just wanted to start an opening poll just to understand the level that people think they're at. So from a RCS perspective, to your knowledge, does your organisation or workplace involve activities with a risk of respirable crystalline silica exposure? So the answers there are yes, and you may have identified those activities and that you've got a robust risk management and control system in place. No, as far as you're aware, it's not applicable to your operations, or you're a bit unsure at this current stage, hence why you're at the webinar. So we'll just give a few minutes for you to answer those.
Almost everyone has nearly answered, so just a few more seconds.
Quick on the buzzer, everyone. Thanks.
All right, I think I'll share them now. We've got most of them.
So we've got quite a mixed across there. We've got about 57% of people are saying that they are, and they've identified activities and they've got a plan in place, which is great. We've got about 29% who don't believe that RCS is applicable to their organisations, and there's quite a substantial proportion of 14% who aren't quite sure. So we're actually going to ask a very similar question at the end of the webinar, and we'll be interested to see how those results may change as we go through. So first of all, let's talk about what is respirable crystalline silica. Julie, I might ask you to give us a quick run through of what is this stuff.
Yeah, sure, Phoebe, thank you. So silica is, chemically speaking, just one atom of silicon and two atoms of oxygen joined together to make silicon dioxide. But they can arrange in many different ways, some non-crystalline, which are known as amorphous, or crystalline forms, as we know, the respirable ones. So the amorphous silica can be things like glassware. Well, that disappeared, didn't it? So like my glass here. And they don't seem to be the same health effects as the respirable crystalline silica. But the ones that we see for the crystalline silica most commonly are those like the quartz on the bottom left picture. And now in that, there's other types too that are less common, like tridymite and cristobalite, to much lesser extent. Now obviously that pretty little crystal there is not a health risk in its current form, but when it's in a material that we can cut, grind, drill, or otherwise fracture, it will release the RCS in a fine dust that we can inhale and get down deep into our lungs. And so the respirable fraction of this dust, which is less than 10 micrometers, which you can see from the graphic there too, is quite small. And that's what we're talking about. That's really getting deep down into our lungs. And there it can cause some serious health effects that include irreversible lung damage, cancer, silicosis, and also being linked to autoimmune diseases like scleroderma, kidney diseases, COPD, bronchitis, and emphysema. So yeah, not good. It's irreversible, but with some awareness and controls, it's fully preventable.
Yeah, so it's a pretty tricky substance. So let's talk about where it can be found. Can you just run us through some of those products we might find RCS in?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So since silicon and oxygen are two of the most abundant elements in the Earth's crust, we'll find it everywhere. And so I'm talking about things like soil, sand, sandstone, cement boards, ceramics, masonry, and other materials that we use commonly in construction. It just varies in concentration amongst the different materials, as you can see in this graphic, with the high end being the reconstituted or manufactured stone, which is as high as over 90%. But yeah, it's virtually everywhere. And did you know that actually back in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, Sydney had a terrible situation where sewer workers, when they were building the sewers for Sydney, started to come down with silicosis, though they misdiagnosed it as tuberculosis back then, because the sandstone, the Hawkesbury sandstone, is over 75% crystalline silica.
Wowza.
Yeah, so it's not new.
No, it's been around for a while. Yeah, okay. So now we know where it's found and what it is. Jason Green, can you give us a quick through of some of the main run through of some of those main industries where we see respirable crystalline silica being generated? I believe you're on mute, Jason. Apologies.
Sorry about that. Yes, I am on mute. Sorry, Phoebe. Yeah, no, that's a I suppose there's three sort of main sort of industries or groups of industries that you can find crystalline silica. So building and construction is a massive one. So you know, there's a lot of activities within those industries: excavation, earth moving, drilling, drilling, and I suppose fracturing and breaking up of natural sandstones. So yeah, Sydney sandstone has up to 70 or 80% pure quartz or silica. So yeah, there's a high hazard profiles around that sort of work. So we've got other things like construction, labouring activities, paving, surfacing, working with brick and concrete, stone cutting, angle grinding, jackhammering, and working with all sorts of those sorts of materials. The other one of the other main industries is your fabrication and manufacturing industries. So that's obviously you've heard of the engineered stone and the stone bench tops, which we'll talk about later. So yeah, that's a big industry. Clay and stone processing operations, and also foundry casting, you can find silica. And then the other main group of industries is your tunnelling, mining, and other sort of industrial sort of industries. So quarrying, mineral ore treating processes, abrasive blasting, where they may be using greater than 1% crystalline silica, hydraulic fracturing or fracking in the gas and oil industry, and then other bits and pieces like pottery making and agriculture related activities.
Wow, so you're basically saying it's pretty much any dust generating activity in any of those industries that may be including a common building material. So it's obviously pretty prolific. So let's look at some of the stats around it as a hazardous chemical. Jason Green, can you just talk through some of the stats that you've put up on this slide here, please?
Yeah, so Safe Work Australia put out some great statistics and done a lot of a study around these areas, and you can see on the screen there's a pie graph there with a blue section, and so that's related to work related incidents or safety issues, where falls, electrocution, things like that, where people had accidents. But the large section in orange is related to work-related illnesses and diseases, such as silicosis. And so that's essentially 8 times the amount of people dying for these work-related illnesses and diseases in comparison to safety-related issues. So it's a massive issue. Yeah.
And with regards to these percentages down here, using maybe the construction one as an example, can you talk through this for us?
Yeah, so they've looked at these various industries. They've looked at the exposures that people are having in these types of activities and tasks. So construction is a massive one, and I suppose 38% of workers that are working in these industries are exposed to silica, and of those workers that are exposed to silica, 67% of those workers are working in environments which are over the exposure standard. So,
wowza, so it is really a serious issue. Okay, so
yes.
Well, now we've understood all of that. I might pass over to you, Jason Linford, just to give us a bit of a summary of the key legislative obligations around respirable crystalline silica.
Yeah, thanks,
What are they?
yeah, thanks, Phoebe. So the WHS Act and the regulations and relevant state OSH action and regulations are the overall governance documentation. Whilst those legislative instruments are not explicit, they do provide the duties and outline the requirements of organisations, of not only organisations but also the workers, and what they need to do to control risks in the workplace. Extending on that, and more recently extending on that, states and territories are starting to work on codes of practice and release those codes of practice that actually provide explicit guidance for organisations on actually how you control those risks and what types of controls you need to put in place. So it's not a guessing game anymore. The codes of practice are defining the actual requirements that we need to implement. The two that are sort of at the fore at the moment is the Queensland Code of Practice as well as the Victorian Compliance Code. The Queensland Code of Practice has been released for the engineered stone industry to start with. However, we're starting to see some changes within the coal industry as well as mining and quarrying within Queensland. A point to note for Queensland is that under Section 26A of their WHS Act, any endorsed code of practice is actually a legislative instrument. Therefore, what is within that code of practice is actually required by law. So it's important for those organisations who are involved in engineered stone fabrication, supply, etc., to understand the contents of that document and ensure that they're applying what is within that document to meet their legal obligations. The Victorian Compliance Code is more so a guidance document. Whilst it's referenced within the regulatory documents, it's only released as a compliance code, and whilst we should be obeying it, it doesn't have the full impact from a legislative point of view that the Queensland document does. However, regardless of the jurisdiction, the overarching requirements of organisations are similar, and it's similar across for any type of contaminant or any type of hazard and risk that's in the workplace. And that is that organisations have a shared duty to ensure that they identify all hazards in the workplace, that they assess the risks, and they implement controls that are in line with the hierarchy of controls. Within the change to the legislation as well, Safe Work Australia released an update to the workplace exposure standards last year, which was endorsed on the 16th of December. That reduced the workplace exposure standard of crystalline silica from 0.1 milligrams per cubic metre to 0.05. So they effectively halved the exposure standard. Now that does have implications to the way that hazard is controlled in the workplace, and certainly does impose additional requirements of organisations to control those risks. Now, just extending on the statistics that Jason just discussed, there was a study in 2016 that extrapolated out across the whole Australian workforce. So roughly we've got 12 million workers in Australia. The study suggests that 6.6 of all Australian workers are exposed to RCS in their day-to-day work activities, with 3.7% of those workers having high level exposure. So if we look at that from a numbers perspective, that's 720,000 workers daily have an exposure to crystalline silica. Therefore, the changes in legislative requirements.
Yeah, you can see the focus now. Yeah, that makes more sense. So let's dive into some case studies and scenarios to give our audience some sort of practical examples of where this might be a risk. And as we spoke about it quite a bit, let's start in the construction sector. Julie, can you talk through this case study around a pool, I believe, in the construction sector?
Yeah, definitely a pool. Yeah, it was a job I was involved with a few years ago. Basically, it was just removal of the ceramic tile from the pool deck, like you see on the left there, from the pool on the right. And that's something that's a local activity done by many people all over the country, I'm sure. So the tiles, well, the contractor that was removing it had taken care to shut the doors, because you can see there is public facing areas very close to it. But they had forgotten about the HVAC system, which was still operating and shared throughout the building. So once they started jackhammering and grinding out the tiles, the staff started to complain of dry eyes and sore throats. Plus there was a noticeable buildup of dust on their desktop and furnishings and computers. So the regulator was called in and the job was shut down, basically. So this was all in the space of a few hours of the work starting, actually. So we went in, did an investigation, which included air sampling for RCS within a few hours of the tools being put down. Yeah, so that just...
Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry. One more down. There we go, thank you. Yeah, so you can see what the pool deck was starting to look like after a few hours of removal. And we sampled that material and it was well over 20% crystalline silica on average. And that dust has spread everywhere. Plus the air samples that we collected, even after work had stopped for 4 hours before we started the samples running, still exceeded the workplace exposure standard.
Wow, that's quite a surprise. Yeah,
exactly, because we were surprised too, because we didn't see dust in the air. And that's the thing too, the crystalline silica doesn't have to be visible for it to be there. It's not necessarily a warning sign. However, our regulator said that if you do see visible emissions of dust, you're probably exceeding the exposure standard.
Okay, that's a good rule of thumb to take on.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in this scenario, was it the contractor who was solely responsible for managing this process? What about the building owner or any workers in the area?
Well, exactly. Everybody has their part to play, of course, but certainly the risk assessment, a proper risk assessment and SWIMS should have been developed by the contractor in this situation before the job started. Different tools and barrier systems would have prevented the expensive cleanup they were faced with, the contractor, because the dust had spread out throughout the whole building. And as the next slide will show, this was more than just a case of putting up barriers and cleaning the pool deck.
So what are we looking at in this picture here?
So yeah, that's the actual ventilation air return adjacent to the pool deck. And you can see there's dust buildup on the base there. And that's just the heavier particles, the stuff that settles out really quickly. Unfortunately, the RCS dust is so fine and light, it just got sucked into the ventilation system and recirculated throughout the building. Since typical HVAC buildings are not designed to capture this dust.
So what could they have put in terms of practical controls to manage this process better?
Oh, absolutely. It's this wouldn't have happened if they'd had barriers, if they turned off the HVAC system in the area, sealed up the opening so nothing could get in. And of course, they need to use proper wetting techniques on their tools and local exhaust ventilation on the tools, or even dust caps like you can see here. And proper M or H class vacuums, because if you just use a regular vacuum without a proper filter, you're just going to make the problem worse.
So I suppose it's really understanding and controlling those risks and proactively managing it and checking it before starting. And it seems like it was a pretty simple mistake on the part of the contractor in this case.
Exactly. Yeah. It was very expensive because they had to have, it was very disruptive. They had to clean the whole building and all the ventilation system.
Eek. So we've talked about almost like a point source here. Now, some of the questions that came in ahead of the webinar were more around large construction sites where you might have big dust clouds and large excavation works. Jason Green, you know, you're on a cement plant site with a client at the moment. Can you talk about some examples of the types of activities going on there where it's an issue?
Yeah, we want to talk about excavations and I suppose working with dusty areas and products that I suppose that contain varying different levels, I suppose, of silica. So I mean it's generally around the aggressive use of tools, the aggressive use of air, and I suppose when you're looking at some of these graphics on the screen here, you can see cutting, you can see hammering, you can see drilling, movement of materials around, which obviously are quite aggressive in their nature, and as Julie mentioned before, I mean you may see a dust cloud, but there may be only a minor sort of dust cloud happening, but that might still be an issue for the workers in those bigger areas.
So on these big complicated sites where you might have multiple activities going underway, how and who is responsible for managing those risks?
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously the building, the site controllers have a big responsibility. The contractors that are doing these works have a big responsibility for protecting their on-site workers, but also with these sorts of sites, they need to be very aware of their neighbours and whether or not this dust is actually going off-site as well. So that's a big consideration.
Yeah, sure. So let's talk more around those specific controls in that scenario. I mean, we're looking here at the hierarchy of controls, which I'm sure everybody's familiar with. In the context of the site you're on at the moment, what sort of levels of controls are being used and what's available to the PCBU in that case?
Yeah, that's right. So, I mean, I suppose elimination is a extremely difficult one in a lot of these situations. I certainly want to look at that, but if it's more than likely moving on to the other harder controls. So, I mean, substitution is a big thing to try and I suppose reduce the number of cut points, the sharpening of blades, I suppose trying to streamline that the work process from the start, and that's those sorts of situations starts before the job is even started on site. So those sorts of things need to be looked at from suppliers of the equipment, the best equipment for the best to get the best output and the lowest airborne dust result. So obviously when you're looking at cutting tools and things like that, you want to make sure that there's guarding, there's things around on tool water, and trying to minimise, I suppose, that dust cloud from the actual point source. So whether it's a hammer, whether it's a massive blade, whether it's an area that needs, I suppose, another part of engineering is local exhaust ventilation. So, but I suppose that water is a key part of it.
And when you say water, what sort of format are we talking in? Are we talking a garden hose or a misting system? What's the setup?
Yes, a garden hose. Yeah, I'm sure plenty of people on this webinar have seen people working with aggressive type tools, and they're essentially using a hose or something similar to try and suppress the dust, and it works to a certain point. But unfortunately, we're dealing with a respirable dust hazard here, and the silica particles are extremely minute. And that sort of water methodology is not satisfactory. We need to be using fine mist sprays to essentially capture that fine particulate which is in the air, and essentially knock it out of the air to I suppose minimise the amount of dust cloud and I suppose the release of that. From the area, and essentially, if it's not managed from that point source as best as people can do, but then there's a highly likely that dust cloud can get into an uncontrolled situation, and then it's a potential high risk situation for on-site people, but also from an environmental perspective as well.
And so then you've got your substitution of less dusty methods, you've got your engineering controls, your ventilation, your water suppression, etc. What about looking down at the bottom end of the hierarchy of controls?
Yeah, your soft end of the hierarchy, your admin controls and your PPE or personal protective equipment. So I suppose there's a lot of things you can do there for reviewing of swims, looking at training, making sure people are competent and experienced in what they're doing for whatever the task that's required, and then PPE, of course, or the use of respiratory protection is at the bottom there, but it's very important now, particularly for silica and the lowering of the exposure standard as well. So I think there's going to be unfortunately or fortunately a more onus looked at for respiratory protection for workers. But
so it's that multifaceted approach really to make sure you're being robust. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So,
to get those.
Sorry.
Yeah.
To move on to our final scenario, we're just going to talk on the engineered stone sector, which is obviously an industry that has received a lot of attention and focus. So, Jason Linford, why has there been so much focus in the engineered stone sector recently?
Yeah, thanks, Phoebe. While silica has been a regulated substance, since Noah was a boy, it hasn't received the notoriety or the public persona of its cousin asbestos. So it's sort of sat there in the background, and asbestos has taken all the news. Whilst asbestos has been the hot topic over the years, it has also been considered an older person's disease. So due to its latency period, you're talking a 15 to 35 years latency period. So you really see asbestos-related diseases in older workers. However, in recent times, RCS has come into the spotlight primarily from the engineered stone industry, due to, the high percentage of the silica concentration within engineered stone products. I think Jason touched on it earlier on, which is greater than 90%. And this has led to an increase in numbers of acute and accelerated silicosis within the or amongst fabricators. Now, that has not been diagnosed or within the older workforce. It's more so now being looked at as a young person's disease, because of the expediency of the issue. So if we look at the three types of silicosis or silicosis diagnosis, there's acute, which can be contracted within as early as 3 weeks from a single high exposure to crystalline silica, and up to 2 years. Accelerated silicosis is normally caused by a short-term exposure to significant amounts of RCS, and has a latency of roughly 1 to 10 years. This was considered a rare form of silicosis, however, is the main form that we're seeing within the engineered stone industry. And then there's the chronic silicosis, which it's the most common, has a latency period of around 15 to 20 years after moderate to low exposures. But it's those two, it's the acute and the accelerated silicosis that is bringing everything to the fore at the moment, and making it in the spotlight. And when we look at the statistics, a recent medical study has after reviewing what was happening in the engineered stone industry, there was a suggestion that up to 30% of the workers initially that were being tested had the potential to be diagnosed with silicosis. Now that the numbers of workers are actually increasing, so they're getting a bigger data pool, which doesn't skew the results as much. So it's now down to the 12% of workers tested within the engineered stone industry have been diagnosed with accelerated silicosis.
Oh my goodness.
And approximately 20% of those have acute silicosis. And so, you know, not to be drastic, but from diagnosis to end of life, the average time span from acute silicosis is 11 months. So it's not something that we should take lightly.
No, and so obviously this is a huge issue for this sector, but in practical terms, what are the risk control options available to fabricators and installers of engineered stone?
Yeah, so as I touched on earlier, the codes of practice that are being released are very explicit and detail what those obligations are, and they are in practical terms as well. So they're not anything that we shouldn't already be doing, but they just give the overarching guidance. And it's very similar to what Jason just said in regards to the construction industry and extraction industry and so forth. You know, we need to look at multiple forms of control, using water suppression, and you know, not the garden hose or the fire hose at the end of the day, but fine mist water suppression to knock that dust out of the air. Local exhaust ventilation or tool extraction, so having shrouds and so forth on the end of the tools with vacuum extraction, etc. Natural ventilation to work areas, negative pressure units if you have isolated rooms and so forth to keep dust inside, control pressure environments and so forth. So that's more so from the higher level controls, looking at an engineered component. But if we go down to the soft controls from an admin perspective, there's the requirements for health surveillance programs. Now those programs are pre, during and post-employment. It's important that they're undertaken by a licensed physician who can put the workers on health surveillance programs, safe work procedures, updating swims, recognising that we do have this hazard in the workplace, and reviewing the current controls that we have and are they actually appropriate, and going through and adjusting those where required. As Jason said, RPE, so whether that's a half face or a full face respirator, even through to PAPR. The Queensland Code of Practice actually stipulates PAPR as a control. So powered
just
air.
The benefit, powered air,
Yeah. The powered air. Good housekeeping practices. So as Julie indicated, the use of M and H class vacuums, no more sweeping up, getting the broom out, but controlling it. And then, through the use of water suppression, there's obviously going to be in a workshop environment, there'll be wet slurry on the ground, disposing of that slurry appropriately, ensuring that it goes into a holding tank. We don't push it down the drains, that we recycle the water that we're using for that, and then how we manage that slurry afterwards is ensuring that personnel are not exposed to the dry bricks that fall from that. So really, through what we've been involved in within the engineered stone industry, it is clear that the fabricators that we've cited and we've audited and we've done baseline monitoring on, that those who use or implement multiple forms of controls are those who have the greatest potential to control the risk and have the lowest levels of RCS in the workplace.
Wow, so thank you very much for that. What we might do now is we've gone through these scenarios, we've talked about it. We'll just have a quick summary. So from listening to your discussions earlier, it's respirable crystalline silica risks are across industries. It seems that it's such a prevalent material in so many places that it's not specific to any one industry, and it's a real consideration that needs to be included in assessments of hazards. I was just thinking when you were giving your presentation, Julie, around electricians and pull-throughs in concretes, and they're doing a lot of cutting and drilling into materials that can hold high concentrations of RCS. So I can imagine, if you're a facilities manager and you have contractors coming into site to do that, even down to that, it's still a legitimate risk. And obviously, as we've talked about, though, that key requirement for PCBUs to identify the hazards, assess the risks, and implement the controls in accordance with the legislation, and that workers need to be adhering to those controls and understanding them, and that multifaceted approach using multiple levels of the hierarchy of controls is our best chance of controlling this effectively, and that we're seeing regulation become more stringent and more focused around this as a particular hazardous chemical. So that concludes our presentation for today, and we'll just finish up with a quick poll. I'm actually going to ask the same question I asked at the beginning, just as keen to understand how people's views may have changed over our discussions. So based off the discussions today, has your opinion changed regarding whether your workplace involves activities with an RCS exposure risk? And we've given 4 actions here. It's yes, it's under control, things haven't changed, or yes, action is needed and you think you might need to go and look at it in more detail. No, the webinar has confirmed that it's definitely not relevant to you, or unsure, you still need further information. So we'll just give it a bit of time for you to put in your responses.
Okay, just a couple more seconds. Just a reminder to ask any questions. There are questions coming in into the Q&A panel, and we'll get to those in a couple of minutes. All right, I think I'll share this now. So
that's really interesting. I think what we're seeing now is we've got 24% saying yes, it's under control, which is great. But we've also had 39% of people saying that action is needed. So perhaps going to look at a bit more detail in those risks. 25% say no, is still not relevant. And then there's 12% who are still unsure. So I'm glad to see we've moved the unsures from 14% to 12%. So that's something. So thank you very much for that, Sarah. We'll move on to our open Q&A now. And I see there's some coming through. So what I'll do is I'll just read some of those out and we'll work through them. So the first point is more of a comment. Julie was saying glass was less of a problem, yet glass as fibre reinforced plastic is, i.e. fiberglass and respiratory problems. Julie, do you want to just take that one? I think it's just more of a comment, but
yeah,
it's a good
sure.
point.
And I apologize. Apparently the sound is very echoey. It wasn't in our practice earlier. Apologies for that. Yeah. So the glass in this format is different from we're talking about the form of the glass, fiberglass versus glass like this in one object. Yes, definitely fiberglass is still an airborne hazard, and we don't want to inhale any dust really, especially the biopersistent fibers or the ones that like fiberglass or ones that aren't soluble and can be cleared from our body. Our motto is to work dust-free and wash your hands, basically, when it comes to hazardous materials.
Yeah, thanks, Julie. Another question here. Does it include plaster? I'm assuming talking around plasterboards and gypsum and plaster. Jason Green, are you able to respond to that one?
Yeah. No, I think there is a percentage of silica within plaster, but I suppose it all sort of depends on the process, I suppose, and how it is actually used on site. So a lot of these sort of products, like cement, like things that we can buy, which are already essentially manufactured, are contains aged silica. So I suppose, yeah, we were talking about a lot of aggressive processes and activities on this webinar, and I suppose they're in the freshly fractured area. So yeah, so there's a higher risk of exposure, and the risk profile is much higher for those types of products as opposed to aged type products like cement, like plaster, things like that. So
yeah. Jason, I might just butt in and ask a follow-up question to that. So one of the questions ahead of the webinar was concerned with dust generation where large areas of soil and land had been cleared. What are the sort of comparative risks associated with soil and weathered loamy material versus freshly fractured sandstone or rocks and concrete, etc.?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so I mean, potentially it could only be a relatively low risk if they're dealing with, normal sort of loamy soils, which do contain a certain percentage of silica, but in comparison, I suppose, to working with sandstone and freshly fracturing that type of material, which has a much higher percentage of silica, it's certainly a much higher risk profile for that sort of a situation. So, but regardless, I mean, if people are undertaking excavation projects, then they need to make sure that dust suppression is constantly being used, that there is no dust essentially emanating from the actual processes and the site excavations that's happening, and avoiding that going off site as well.
Thank you. So moving on to the next question now. Have there been any instances of concern from the use of powdered garnet for sandblasting, i.e. manufacturing frosted glass, or water jets cutting glass handling the dry garnet powder? That's Jason or Julie, feel free to chip in.
Sure, I can speak to that. I guess it's hard to answer without knowing a bit more details about how the person is using it. Are they using it in a fume hood, or sorry, a little cabinet where there's a local exhaust ventilation, and they just got their hands in a cabinet, that sort of thing, or they're full on in supplied air and basically in the space blasting it. I imagine for frosted glass, it's in a smaller area. But sure, it goes back to my original point about inhaling all dust is not recommended, and we want to minimize our exposure to it.
Thanks, Julie. Jason, did you have anything to add to that one?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose powdered garnet materials, I suppose, are historically quite low silica content, but I mean, yeah, sandblasting is an incredibly aggressive activity. So so those, they just, as Julie was saying, that those processes need to be controlled heavily, and to prevent people being exposed. So I suppose if there is a concern around that specific type of activity, and there hasn't been any baseline monitoring or risk assessment done, then that's probably a first point of call. And I suppose you want to look at the material safety data sheets for these sorts of things, and looking at those materials from that point of view, so that you can adequately design a hygiene program around assessing the risks fully.
Another question, moving on. How far away are we from real-time RCS monitoring? I might stay with you there, Jason.
Well, I mean, there's people working on it at the moment as we speak. I'm hearing some cool things coming out of the UK, but yeah, it might be a while yet. So yeah, I can't say really how long. I mean, I'd like it to be here this year, but I don't seriously doubt that. But possibly there might be something happening later on next year. I'm not too sure really, but yeah, I mean, yeah, I'm really excited about that technology, and that it's going to be a real game changer for a lot of industries. And yeah, I suppose a lot of industries are already sort of using real-time, I suppose, respirable dust monitoring techniques, and then looking at their silica contents and making some judgment calls there. But yeah, certainly that has a limited. Yeah, it's on the way.
Yeah, there's currently a study being done by the Centre for Work Health and Safety in New South Wales, which is focusing primarily on real-time monitoring for silica. So that was due to end, the study was due to end in October this year, but forms part of their roadmap for the reduction of workplace injuries by 50% by the end of 2022. So the study will happen, and then they've got to go through, understand what types of monitors are out there, and then they're talking about developing their own prototype monitor that will go into testing as well.
Oh wow! So it's definitely
when that will be.
Who knows?
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the University of Wollongong have got some PhD people working on it as well, which yeah, very exciting.
So on to a slightly different topic now. If using PPE, can you confirm if clothing should be changed similar to asbestos? And should contractors provide decontamination facilities? Jason Linford, can you take that one?
Yeah, the short answer is yes. Yes, you should. You have to, and there is some very good guidance in both the Queensland Code of Practice and the Victorian Compliance Code for that. And whilst those documents have been written primarily for the engineered stone industry, the actual processes and controls that they put in place can be used across any industry. It's just that they release those for engineered stone in the immediate term due to the higher prevalence of silicosis within that industry. So it's an attempt to control that and mitigate the current cases. But in short, yes, you need to. Now, some of the controls that you can do is they have a dedicated change room, keep the clothing on site, launder that clothing appropriately, etc. Have isolated zones so workers who have been exposed to the dust don't go into like admin areas and so forth. But also having a simple process of having a HVAC vacuum cleaner at the end of the work zones that workers before breaks and going into the isolation rooms can actually give themselves a vacuum down. And that one's actually stipulated in the Queensland Code of Practice that you need to have a HVAC at the end of work areas. So yes, you need to control that, absolutely.
May I just add one thing there too to that excellent response? Just that unlike with the asbestos clothing, which is the waste disposal is very heavily regulated, the silica disposal is not. So we just are taking care not to re-entrain the dust into the air.
Yep.
And I suppose I'll add just one final thing there as well. There's people are now installing onto site essentially booths that people can actually step into and essentially remove the dust from them from a massive downdraft extraction sort of methodology, which I think it's called a bat booth. So you step in and you decon, and then you come out as Batman, I suppose.
With cape and all, brilliant.
Yes.
Moving on to the next question now. With exploration drilling, how are the legal obligations shared between the company contracting the drillers and the drilling company themselves? So I think this question speaks to the division of responsibility, and it would be applicable in any industry. So Jason Linford, can you take that one?
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, so there is a shared obligation. So obviously the owner of the site or the principal contractor is responsible for the overall safety. However, subcontractors all the way down the line are also responsible for their own safety and the safety of their own workers. And then us as individuals are also responsible for our own safety and the health and safety of the others that we work with. So from a cascading perspective, the site owner has ultimate duty of care for the overall site. That whilst that tries to be dissolved down the chain to say this was your fault type thing, as you get lower in the level, the legislation is clear that the owner of the site has the primary duty of care, but then each contractor / subcontractor and worker on that site also has responsibility for ensuring the safety of themselves, their workers, and those around them.
And I think that just to add back to a question that was raised prior to the webinar, somebody mentioned about it was very, very difficult sometimes to get workers to actually wear their dust masks and their respirators in this context. What advice would you give to organisations who are trying to implement those sort of controls where they're getting that strong resistance from people around the dust?
Yeah, look, I think it's an education piece. There is a legal obligation to wear PPE, if provided. And so, you know, we need to step back and look at, one, what's our duty of care requirements under the relevant act and legislation, and then what are the hazards that we have on site, what are the risks associated to those hazards, and what are our control mechanisms for those risks. Now, if PPE or RPE is a control mechanism, then it's a legal obligation of the worker to actually wear that wear the PPE/RPE as a form of control that is on to mitigate that risk. But it comes down to the education piece of really explaining why it is there, you know, and you know, I use the analogy that the WHS Act and the OSH Act and all these types of acts that are aligned to health and safety are no different to the Road Traffic Act or any other act of Parliament. They are legislative instruments, and so if we are required to get in our car and put on a seatbelt because that's what the Road Traffic Act says, then if we're required to put on an RPE, then when we turn up to work, we should put on our RPE or seatbelt because that's what that act says as well. But again, it just comes back to the education piece.
I'll move on to the next question now. Looking at safety and design principles, and I suppose this goes to the elimination substitution question. Are there better types of concrete in construction, i.e. less hazardous for forming the fine dust when drilled? I'll open that up to the panel. Who would like to take that one?
Yeah, I'll have a crack. I suppose, yeah, the short answer is, yeah, I don't really know, but I suppose we want to make sure that, yeah, if there is a possibility that they can lower the silica content within these types of materials, then that obviously is going to lower the risk profile quite significantly. So yeah, I'm unsure myself.
And I suppose it comes down to the aggregate and because it's obviously bound up in the cement, and then so I suppose it all depends on your percentages and whether there's any polymer additives within that particular concrete. But yeah, it's something.
The processes, the activities. Yeah.
And there is discussions within the engineered stone industry about modification of their product. You know, it is greater than 90% silica content. The R&D world in the engineered stone industry is working extremely hard to try and reduce that silica, the silica content within that product. However, the discussions that we've had with them certainly indicate that the less silica that they have in the product changes the overall structure of the product, and therefore requires additional fabrication processes, but also control processes after, just like natural stone, you know, where you've got to have the sealing and all of that happens afterwards. So they're trying to find that fine line between having a product that is as robust as engineered stone for the price, and then trying to reduce the risk to make it, still keep it a robust product that doesn't require post-fabrication processes to make it a viable product, and then also not to increase the cost of that product. Otherwise, we might as well just use natural stone.
And I suppose that's then the same ring trues of concrete. Like you've got to balance the structural grade of the concrete. But yeah, we might move on. This one's an interesting question. I'm not sure we will get to the end of this one. How do you think the Australian government will manage silicosis in migrant workers? The benchtop fabrication industry is full of skilled migrant workers that came over in the boom of man-made stone manufacture, which a lot of these tradespeople would have had large exposure to silica without controls in place. And it's a really difficult topic because it's something that has been very closely looked at as this has come out. Jason Linford, I might take this one back to you because you were heavily involved in dealing with the rollout of these programs in this sector.
Yeah, it is a difficult one to answer. but from a employer obligation, it doesn't matter where the worker came from. If they are working for you as an employee or as a worker, then they receive the same obligations as any other worker. The issue that I suppose we would face in that instance would be from a workers' compensation perspective, and how that's applied under the types of visa that they had when they came into the country, and have they now left the country and so forth and gone back to their homeland and then contracted the illness afterwards. So it is a difficult one to answer, and it would be addressed from a case-by-case scenario, dependent on the type of employment contracts that were in place, the visas that were applied, the extent of service, and when it comes to all of this, very much so like asbestos was back in the days, is where does the responsibility lie for the contraction of the illness? So if that worker has worked at a single point or a single employee for their whole working career, then you could quite comfortably argue that it was contracted through that employment. But if that worker has worked across 20 different employers and different fabrication workshops, then at which stage did that individual contract the silicosis? What was the underlying factor to that? And hence there's discussions around shared responsibility. So something that's just coming out at the moment is the class action to be announced for the engineered stone industry, which is looking at both the suppliers and the fabricators within that process, which will look at shared responsibility. So it's not going to just define it as to a single employer, it will define it across the working life and potential exposure at the various locations of employment.
Thanks, Jason. And apologies, everybody in the audience. I will just draw your attention. Following on this webinar, we do have some downloadable free resources for you. You can download those by going to the link provided there. We will also email out the information afterwards where we have your email addresses. So yeah, if you can click on the link and then you can get that, and then you'll also be able to ask us any questions following up. And we've probably got quite time for one more question. I'm very conscious we've got a lot more that we haven't answered. So anything we haven't answered, we will do our best to follow up with you where we have your contact details after the webinar. So I will just take one more question. So I'm just looking at one over here. There's lots coming, sorry. Okay, let's just have a look. I'm so sorry, I've got so many coming at us, which is great. It's obviously a big issue. Okay, so the most common risk in housing construction is in mixing cement-based products, i.e. emptying bags of cement, dry mortar mix, dry render, etc. So when the dry bags of product emptied, in the majority of the cases, the worker's face is directly in the dust cloud, and disposable masks here are next to useless, and the water spray does little to reduce the dust. Can we just talk quickly around how they might be able to address that particular issue in that? Julie, do you want to take that one?
Sure, I guess you go through the hierarchy of controls again. We can't do the elimination substitution, so the next one's the isolation. Is there some way we can get it done with the worker shielded somehow? Are there any, I know this happens with bakers a lot and flour too, they get a lot of dust in their face. So they have some shields or pour chutes that they can use to help suppress the dust. There's many things that could be done, I'm sure. Just would have to look at the size that they're, take a risk assessment basically to see what size they're mixing. Are they doing it in a wheelbarrow, or is it in a whatever container? So there's many different options for sure. Definitely can look at that.
All right, we'll wrap it up there. Thank you so much for all of your questions. We will make a record of those and try and get back to the ones that we haven't been able to answer during this session. And our contact details are up on the page there. Should you wish to send anything through, please do contact us. We're happy to answer anything that you may have queries around. On that note, I'll pass back to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Phoebe. Yes, I'd like to thank the whole Greencap team there, because it was you provided a lot of very valuable insights, and the feedback that's coming through is also fantastic. So thank you to every one of you. And just a reminder, we will send out recordings, podcasts, everything later today, all those links. So check your email inboxes. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day. Okay, bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.